Does God choose your spouse? That's an age-old question that sparked a lot of debate. I think one of the reasons there's so much debate about this topic is because, for one, we're using different terms in the way that we're asking the question. The other reason there's a lot of debate is because we're coming from this question with different theological foundations. So, in this video, I'm going to give you a very straight answer about does God pick your spouse, and then I'm going to explain why I answer it that way. And if you're someone who feels ready to do a deep Bible study on preparing for a relationship, I wanted to let you know that I'm currently offering my 5 most popular courses at AGW University at a greatly reduced tuition cost. This bundle will only be available for people who enroll before May 28th. To learn more, feel free to click the link in the description of this video. Number 1, yes, God does choose your spouse. The main reason I'm quick to answer this question with a yes is because we have to be theologically consistent. In other words, if we were to say that no, God does not choose your spouse, we would have to ignore all of the scriptures about God sovereignly producing what occurs in this world. We could point to many Bible verses, but let's just highlight one. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. It states, "In him," meaning Christ, "we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will." When it states that God works all things according to the counsel of his will, that certainly includes who we end up marrying. Number 2, yes, you choose your spouse. Notice that I did not just contradict point 1. I did not say, no, God does not choose your spouse. That would be a contradiction. I said that, yes, you choose your spouse. We often assume that for God to choose our spouse, that means we aren't the ones choosing our spouse. And if we say that we are the ones choosing our spouse, then we're saying God's not the one choosing our spouse. But that doesn't have to be true. One yes here does not require a no. Both can be yes. The reason we can say that God chooses your spouse and you choose your spouse is because that's how the Bible talks about all of human decisions. God's sovereignty does not negate human responsibility, and human responsibility does not negate God's sovereignty. Again, this is a topic we could list numerous scriptures, but let's just highlight one. Acts 2, verse 23. "This man," meaning Jesus, "was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." So who ordained the crucifixion of Jesus? God did. Now, who actually sinned against Jesus by putting him on the cross in a wrong way? He didn't deserve it, and the human elements at play lied and were murderous towards Jesus. God didn't cause those people to sin. They chose to do that. So how can God be sovereign and have these outcomes occur that he wants to occur while not violating human free will and us still making choices of our own volition? I don't know. That's just simply what scripture states. This whole idea of who chooses your spouse, God or you, is really the same question about who chooses your salvation, God or you. The Bible's clear. God chooses those who are saved, and we are all held responsible for our choices regarding rejecting Jesus or receiving his grace through faith. In J.I. Packer's book called Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, he states, Charles Spurgeon was once asked if he could reconcile these two truths to each other. "I wouldn't try," he replied. "I never reconcile friends." Friends? Yes, friends. This is the point that we have to grasp. In the Bible, divine sovereignty and human responsibility are not enemies. They are not uneasy neighbors. They are not in an endless state of cold war with each other. They are friends, and they work together. Point 3, God does not cause sin, but he is sovereign over sin. Another layer that complicates this question of whether or not God picks your spouse or not is that a lot of times relationships and choices in spouses result in sin, or maybe even have elements of sin in them. So how can we say that God has sovereignly called someone to marry another person that Scripture would forbid them to marry, but they do it anyway. For example, Scripture is very clear about not marrying an unbeliever if you are a believer, but we all know that people have done that. So how could God be the one who chose this type of spouse for that person? There's a lot of ways we could answer that question, but I think probably the most helpful answer is to remember that in Scripture, there's actually at least two different types of God's will. First, there's God's sovereign will. That's what's going to happen because God ordained it. It's not something that we produce through our human effort. It's something that God produces through his power. So anything that God ordains is going to happen. Second, there's God's prescribed will. This is what he wants us to do. He's commanded us to do in Scripture, but we have the choice to do or not do. God's law is God's will for us, but obviously we don't always follow God's law. Thus, when you're talking about God's will, you have to consider both sides of what that phrase could mean, and then when you put them together, you can say that God's sovereign will works through human choices to obey or disobey God's prescribed will. So it's not accurate to say that God wanted a Christian to marry an unbeliever, for example, but it's also not accurate to say that the outcome that occurred because of these human choices were outside of God's sovereign plan. God does not cause sin or lead people into sin, but he is definitely still sovereign over sin and over the outcomes that occur. We reap what we sow because God still causes to grow what we plant. And number 4, the one does not mean that there's a perfect match for everyone out there. Some people vehemently deny this idea of God choosing your spouse because they're thinking of it in the terms of a soulmate, where there is this perfect match for everybody, and if you don't find your perfect match, then you'll never be happy. And not only that, if you marry the wrong person, you'll set off a cosmic chain of events that will cause other people to also then not be married to the right person. And thus people think, well, God would never do that because that's silly. And yeah, that is silly, but it's also silly to say that God could ordain something and will it to happen, and then man has the power to stop it. In other words, God's sovereign will is not dependent on us. So this whole idea of God ordaining you to be with someone and then you rejecting it is not, that's a false premise to this hypothetical, well, you could marry the wrong person and then set off a cosmic chain of events that everyone else would be with the wrong person. No, because you're forgetting the fact that if God ordained it, it's going to happen. Additionally, this idea that God chooses your spouse is not saying that there's one perfect person out there for you, and the person God chooses for you is going to be this magical person that you fit with perfectly. Again, we still have choice. Humans still make good and bad decisions that have good and bad consequences that are included in God's sovereign plan. Thirdly, there are definitely people who will be chosen by God to be married more than once, such as in the cases of widows. There are also other people who have been gifted with the call to singleness, and they don't have anyone that they'll be married to. Therefore, when I use this phrase, the one, I'm not talking about a soulmate. I'm talking about the person God has planned for you to marry. You'll know you've met the one when you apply the scriptures and God sovereignly allows this relationship to come to fruition. As you can see, thinking biblically about relationships can be very difficult at times, and that's one of the reasons I created AGW University. These courses are an in-depth study for those of you who feel called to marriage one day, but you want to use your season of singleness to prepare well for that season. So right now I'm offering 5 of my most popular and helpful courses about preparing for a relationship. They're bundled together to save you a lot of tuition cost. And this deal will only be available for those of you who enroll before May 28th. So if that's something you're interested in, you just want to check it out, click the link in the description of this video. You'll be able to see all the details there. I'm Mark from ApplyGodsWord.com. Until next time, God bless.